Hey, this is Professor Wham again, doing part 2 now that my website is back up of Contact with Colliding Worlds, some Trinity forensic considerations. So this is basically my overall review of Trinity, the Best Kept Secret, by Jacques Vallee and Paola Leopizzi, Harris. Not sure how to pronounce her name. I will be focusing on the first edition, which is represented by this cover. If you go to Amazon, you'll notice they've changed the cover to something that is really pretty tacky. But anyway, I will be focusing on this first edition. The new edition supposedly has some new vital information, and I will eventually read it, but not right now. Now, if you've checked out part 1, you've noticed that the opening paragraphs provide a basic overview of the Baca Padilla case, also known as the San Antonio, New Mexico UFO crash case. So I'm not going to rehash those details here. You can go back and you can read or watch the blog, vlog, whichever you prefer, to get some of the basic details of the case. What I'm going to focus on are specific features of Vallee's approach in this case, as well as mention some principal criticisms leveled against Vallee by members of the UFO community. Now, I would have my own questions for Vallee should I ever have a chance to ask him. Since I'm more interested in his processes of analysis rather than in demonstrating that I'm right and he's wrong, some might not be satisfied with what I concern myself here. I don't care. Write your own blog. This is mine. This is what interested me about what he had to say in the book. Now, I came to this book, Trinity, without knowing much about Paola Leopizzi Harris, because I tend to separate myself from many of the larger controversies of the larger UFO community, and so I didn't know about her associations with controversial topics, such as the alien autopsy film, exopolitics, off-world secret governments, all that kind of stuff, which apparently she has gotten into. Now, Vallee doesn't mention any of these controversies. He is solely interested in the interview material that Harris has accumulated from the witnesses. Some of this interview material predates her later writing or her later interests in things like exopolitics. So she actually did some of the research and the interviews for this book prior to some of those publications, which is something that critics of her inclusion in this book have seemed to miss, that she was actually interested in this prior to some of her subsequent interests. Vallee explains his interest in the Baca Padilla case by telling the story of how a trusted research buddy of his, a guy named Ron Brinkley, who died in a rather unusual traffic accident prior to the publication of Trinity, encouraged him to look into the account himself. Brinkley recommended Harris because she was literally the only person who had done any in-depth work on the case, even though it has been mentioned by other investigators, Timothy Good being one of them, Six Killer Clark being another one. And I think that there have been a couple of other mentions of this case, if I'm not mistaken. I just can't remember who did it. So that seems to be the level of Vallee's interest in Harris. Basically, she had the contacts, had done the interviews, and had more background research on the case than anyone else. So where the hell else was he supposed to begin? I mean, you go with the person who's done the most research. So the text basically utilizes her work accordingly. Harris tracks down contacts, provides and does the interviews, and some background. Vallee provides more context, does the analyses, and asks the big questions. There is no discussion here in this book about the alien autopsy film, exopolitics, or anything else with which Harris has been connected. And therefore, my conclusion from that is just take the book as it is. Don't do the whole guilt by association thing. Just take it as it is. Harris's interviews with the witnesses from what I could tell from reading them, don't seem all that unusual to me, particularly as I've interviewed literally dozens of contactees and abductees myself. None of the principal witnesses had been hypnotized at the time of their primary interviews, and so she is working with individually remembered material. Harris also lets her subjects do most of the talking, and when she does ask leading questions, it is to gain clarity. In many cases, Baca and Padilla brush her questions aside or indicate that a different aspect of their account is more important than her question. And there are some good examples of this if you want to look at them up quickly in a follow-up interview that Harris did with Padilla that is recorded and recounted on pages 167 to 168 regarding the water tower incident or aspect of the case. Now, from my perspective, the reader is really left to draw his or her own conclusions, given the nature of the evidence, new analysis, and the pattern interpretation that Vallee seems to be considering. So I would encourage readers to do the same. Among the cases that he brings together to provide pattern context, or what you could call a forensic profile, if you will, for the Baca Padilla case, are two that are quite controversial, one of which is widely considered a hoax. And he doesn't include one of the best documented cases with physical evidence that comes out of Canada. So this is where my own questions and considerations begin. Vallee includes the Maury Island incident in his forensic profile list, despite the fact that the case is widely considered by most investigators now to have probably been a hoax. Indeed, Kenneth Arnold, who had been sent out to investigate the case by Ray Palmer, concluded as much almost immediately. Vallee's criteria for inclusion seemed to be that there were said to be multiple witnesses, some of whom suffered reported physiological effects, complex bungled investigations by various alphabet government agencies, including the FBI, which yielded mixed results, and the purport of physical evidence that had been, or possibly, or could have been, examined. Now, without really commenting on the veracity of the Maury Island incident, it seems to provide Vallee with a kind of template. It is interesting to me that this template may depict a type of story about an event, rather than what might have actually happened, whatever that may mean, and that the template of the story is important to exactly the same degree, but not in the same way as what physical evidence might be available for examination. For example, while it is very true that the individuals principally involved in reporting the Maury Island incident, Harold Dahl and Fred Chrisman, have been largely discredited, the latter because he was clearly or probably, depending on the source one consults, a CIA operative, there are still odd aspects about the case that connect directly to the supposed physical evidence. For example, the fact that Palmer and Arnold were able to analyze some of the material that Arnold had secreted away, and although it was clearly of terrestrial origin, it was and remains unclear exactly how that particular alloy of materials, which Vallee does describe in other writings, could have been obtained given the context of the incident itself, plus the fact that two investigating military officers transporting supposed samples of the material did die in a mysterious plane crash with materials on board. Those materials then later apparently disappeared. Now, while the latter accident could have been a coincidence, and certainly the entire circumstance does seem to read now like a psyops operation, one has to remember how early this report was and how elaborate the hoax would have had to have been. And for what reason? Is it in fact tied in some way to both Arnold's sighting or the Roswell crash? Folks seem to forget that all three of these reports occurred within a 4 to 5 week period, basically within a month of each other. For Vallee, the materials point to something more, even if the event was hoaxed, as in the Benowitz case. The fact of the elaborate obscuration points to something needing to be obscured. Now, Vallee's careful analysis also reveals what really interests him about the Socorro case. which is also considered by some to be a hoax or perhaps a misidentification, and how he connects it to the Baca Padilla account. This in addition to the fact that the Socorro incident was very close to the site of the Baca Padilla incident. He returns to the original reports, elided by Project Blue Book, and unknown or ignored by many investigators, which reveal that not only was there substantial physical evidence found at the site and dutifully reported by a police investigator, but as in the Baca Padilla report, there were important third and fourth respectable and reputable witnesses whose accounts corroborate Zamora's in time and place, but undermine the assertions of hoax and misidentified military experiment. While Blue Book investigators did collect these extra witness reports, they declined to mention them in their final breakdown of the case. Vallee succinctly shows that in both the Baca Padilla and Socorro cases, some observing party carefully ignored, covered up, or even tried to dispose of the physical evidence recorded in reliable reports, even to the point of Blue Book deliberately providing an incorrect rendering of the insignia that Zamora says he saw on the craft to the press. Now this leads into Vallee's analysis of what few physical traces could be said to remain in the Baca Padilla case. There are three reported pieces of physical evidence: a thin foil-like metal which when crumpled returned to normal shape, angel hair-like material that seemed to glow in the dark and which, according to the third witness, seemed to prickle the hands if played with, as the children did, and finally a bracket, which Jose said that he actually pried off the wall of the interior of the object or craft with a crowbar at one point before the full military cleanup had begun. At that point, there had only been a few investigators to the site prior. Now, the only piece of this evidence that still remains is the bracket. According to Rime and Jose, at some point, the foil was used to repair the windmill because they needed to water their cattle, and the angel hair, in fact, it almost sounds like fiber optic material as it's described, was divided up between the boys and various cousins and other kids for them to play with over the years. Although this sounds very convenient for skeptics, once one actually reads the interviews, it's not hard to see how and why these materials would have come to these kinds of ends. After all, eventually no one was really after them, and necessity might require the retooling of even remarkable materials. So from the book, Trinity, these are a couple of pictures that I've taken from the book. On the left is the bracket in question, which I'll talk a little bit more about. It's referred to as Silliman bracket, the bracket. That is, I believe, the name of the type of alloy that it's supposed to represent. And then on the right is a picture of one of the follow-up investigations to the site, where they're doing kind of a sweep to see if there's any chance after all this time of any additional residual samples coming up, which of course there wouldn't have been. And this is also taken from Trinity. Since I mentioned it, I thought I would show it because it is sort of interesting. Vallee has changed his analysis of the Socorro case several times over the years, but this is what he's talking about right now. Basically, these are different renditions of the insignia that Lonnie Zamora claimed that he saw on the side of the craft that he saw land. And the one on the far left, the simple drawing, is a drawing that Dr. Hynek made of the Socorro design based on his direct contact with Lonnie Zamora. The B represents the currently accepted official insignia that has been promoted to the press. And the one on the far right is an incorrect version that was given out to the press by Project Blue Book in 1964. You still see it. You still see that rendering. In fact, I did some Wikipedia searches earlier before I put this vlog together and found that this false insignia was still being used in some renderings of the Zecora craft. So it's still out there. Some critics have made the claim that one cannot trust the memories of Rime and Jose because of the malleability of the memory process itself. When put side by side, their accounts do differ some, as they would. However, this is often considered by investigators to be more an index of truth than it is a falsity. This kind of divergence occurs all the time in crime witness reports, for example. Not even Betty and Barney Hill actually remembered exactly the same things, and they told very different stories of their experiences. A thorough and interesting investigation of the efficacy of memory is detailed in a highly recommended documentary series called The Keepers. I personally recommend it a lot, which one can stream on Netflix. It is a record of the decades-long investigation into the disappearance and death of Catherine Sesnick, a nun who was murdered in 1969 in Baltimore, Maryland. It is also an expose of how the Baltimore diocese covered up sexual crimes committed against young women during the same time period by a small cadre of priests and their possible connection to the Sesnick murder. Now, among the witnesses is a woman who, as a young girl, had been taken by the offending priests to view Sesnick's body as a warning of what would happen to her if she talked. Her experiences were so shocking that she couldn't remember much of what happened to her for many years, until she finally began a meditation practice that slowly began to restore and heal her memories. As a result, she recalled many specific details about the murder scene, in particular, that were later used to verify and link her molesters to the crime. However, due to the discrediting of repressed memory syndrome in the press generally, mostly because of the misapplication of hypnosis, which she did not use, during both the Satanic Panic and by UFO abductee investigators, her memories were largely discounted until a pathologist's report about Sesnick's autopsy, released years later, vindicated her recollections. What her account reveals, and as is discussed in the series, memories of extreme events can be extremely accurate as long as they are allowed to emerge on their own without interference by external authorities. And if there is corroborating evidence to back up the memories, then obviously it is even better. Critics who say that Rime and Jose could simply not be remembering things correctly because their memories diverge at certain points don't really understand how these things can work. It is perfectly plausible for Rime and Jose to remember certain aspects of an event they shared distinctly, differently, and individually, and yet for that basic event to have occurred. Now, much to Harris's and Vallee's credit, they were able to track down an independent third witness, a cousin named Sabrina, who was present on the ranch in the weeks immediately following the crash incident. Without prompting and without prior knowledge of what was going to be discussed, she hadn't been in contact with Rime or Jose for years and didn't even know what the interview was going to be about at first. She mentioned the physical objects, the stories and rumors of the craft that the family talked about, and especially the angel hair material because she had been given some, and then later gave it to her children to play with until the material was scattered and lost. In fact, the attitude that Jose, Rime, and Sabrina have toward these special objects reminded me a bit of Joe Simonton's reaction to the strange alien pancakes that he was given by his apparent otherworldly visitors, except that one can't really use pancakes to repair anything. As John Keel would have it, Jose and Rime's completely normal human responses to extraordinary events, their unwillingness to embellish their stories, it's actually a pretty plain and average account, is probably the best indicator that something happened, or at least they remember something that happened. Now that leaves the bracket, and this is where the pickle juice actually begins to show its brine. The bracket has survived, as I indicated in the picture that I showed you. The two boys showed it to their father and then hid the object in various places throughout their home and compound until finally retrieving it and stashing it away once the boys, later men, moved on with their lives. Vallee saw the bracket, held it, took a photo. It looks for all the world like a regular bracket, albeit broken, that might be used on farm equipment or in construction of some kind. In fact, Vallee says he tended to believe that the bracket was something left behind by the first military unit that came to investigate and clean up the site, except for 3 curious facts. After the cleanup at the site, the family were approached several times by military officials inquiring whether they had, quote, found, unquote, anything like a bracket at the site they were hiding. This persistence on the part of the military was so strong that it seemed very strange to Vallee that such an interest would be shown toward a simple military bracket of terrestrial origin. Then, after these military inquiries had spooked them, the boys buried the bracket under the floor of a neighboring shed. One evening, an older neighbor, a herder, needed to spend a night in the shed, which was often used as a makeshift guest house for people passing through. The next morning, the herder told Jose's father that he'd had a strange and frightening dream the night before, in which 3 ugly men or entities approached him and demanded to know where their taken object was hidden. The herder knew nothing about the sighting, the craft, the object, or anything else about the family experience, but never again would he stay in that shed. And finally, when Vallee was speaking to one of the scientists who had done a materials analysis on the bracket, he voiced his opinion that the bracket was probably just a broken farm or military implement, especially when he read the initial report that there was nothing too exotic about the metals in the object. The scientist interrupted him and strongly disagreed, saying that while the metals and compounds in the bracket are readily available on Earth, the actual mixture and composition of the bracket itself was highly unusual, and that he'd never seen anything quite like it before, and certainly it wouldn't have been available at the time and date when it was discovered. It certainly wasn't something a rural rancher and his kids in Podunk, New Mexico could have come up with. So there's the weird. For those critics who claim that Vallee has been fooled by 2 bumpkins with a broken farm bracket to show for it, well, it's a bit more complicated than that. One would do well to read the whole book. Now, for my part, I wondered why Vallee had not included the 1967 Falcon Lake, Canada case in his forensic profile list. There are certainly many parallels, including the very real physiological effects on the witness, the principal witness, Stephen Michalak, effects that probably contributed to his relatively early death, strange dreams and affects, an impossibly complex investigation by various Canadian authorities, which resulted in, well, weird conclusions, and very odd physical evidence that was left at the incident site. It wasn't really a landing site. The object didn't land per se. There was no crash here, and there were no observed occupants. However, Michalak certainly believed something intelligent was behind the craft that he was so close to that he was able to touch. And for those of you who may need to be reminded about what the Falcon Lake case was, I have included here a few pictures from a website that talks about it from Atlas Obscura. What this case is mostly known for, and Jacques Vallee has talked about this case in some of his other writings, are the injuries that Stephen Michalak had as a result of his encounter. This is a photo, for example, of the burns that appeared on his chest and on his torso as a result of his actual physical contact with the object. And I would encourage you to look this case up if you're not familiar with it. These spots on his torso, according to his son, remained for several years and would occasionally crop up again and blister and were extremely painful. Michalak was unable to work for the better part of a year after his experience because he was afflicted by some very strange radioactive effects from his experience. So this is one of those cases which, if you don't know about it, you need to find out about it. It's got some very interesting details in it. For investigator Chris Rutkowski, who does an amazing amount of forensic digging in his report on the case, this book right here, When They Appeared, which the Falcon Lake case is all the more remarkable because the more one knows about it, the weirder the weird gets. And this is probably the best book about it. This book is not always available. It seems to go in and out of print. It has something to do with the people who publish it in Canada. But if you can get a copy of this book, it's probably one of the most complete reports of all aspects of a truly bizarre case that really needs to be known more in the States, if you don't know about it, than almost any one I've ever read about. And this is a great and very complete volume. He finds, for example, Chris Rutkowski does, that there are really some odd characters that pop up in these stories. And although they are often used to discredit accounts, as in Stephen Michalak's strange relationship with a man named Gary Hart, who posed as an investigator but was actually an obsessed crank who kind of stanned Michalak and made life hard for both the Michalak family and the Royal Mounted Canadian Police who tried to investigate on their own. These people often have their own strange part to play in the UFO drama. And we're not even going to talk about some of the possible MIB stuff in the case. There's some really definite weird military stuff in this case. It was Hart who helped Michalak finally locate the probable site of the encounter. Michalak had been so injured by his exposure to some kind of never-identified radioactivity during the incident that his mind was a little muddled about the exact location. There is also some evidence of a psychic element in his memory of the initial sighting, which when you read his account, you'll pick that up if you're sensitive to those kinds of elements of reports. It was Hart who provided a sense of stability for Michalak because he absolutely believed something strange had happened, whereas Michalak, for all his injuries, tended to believe he'd encountered some kind of secret craft from the United States. Now, by the way, the story of Stephen Michalak is interesting in its own right. His account was largely ignored initially because he was a recent Polish immigrant to Canada, and of course he wasn't from the U.S., so investigators in the States have tended to ignore him too. His family suffered a great deal due to the local publicity that the case got at the time. But basically, he was a good, solid citizen and human being, just like Lonnie Zamora, Rime Baca, and Jose Badia. One could not ask for a better witness to high strangeness events. Now, once they found the location of the incident, Michalak and subsequent investigators were able to actually record and retrieve some kind of real physical evidence that something odd had occurred. And this is where the parallels to the Baca-Badia case begin. First, there were many, many trees that had been damaged by the ascent of the craft at Falcon Lake. And in this case, of course, like I said, was not a crash, and by apparent heat and radioactivity that was connected to that ascent. Second, investigators found a strange silver alloy that appeared to have either been poured into the cracks of the large outcroppings of rock above which the craft had hovered or sprinkled around. Michalak had been out prospecting for precious metals at the time of his encounter, but what was found, when analyzed, samples of which still exist, is unlike any kind of alloy commonly made or found in nature. Furthermore, it appears to have been deliberately poured into fissures or placed on the outcrop, but by whom and for what purpose? Now, the metal samples exist and cannot be easily explained. The location is extremely remote. It is not even known for sure whether the silver has anything specifically to do with the very physical craft that Michalak encountered, although what the silver would have been doing there otherwise is literally anyone's guess. On a subsequent visit to the site, Michalak and investigators discovered that someone, the Canadian Forest Service, had haphazardly attempted to remove some of the damaged trees and plant new ones, although whoever had undertaken the task had not followed the rather strict dictates of the Forest Service for rehabbing damaged wilderness sites. Thus, when Vallee mentioned that on one of their initial site field investigations, when Jose Padilla first took this team to the location of the crash, and they found that the entire specific crash site had been carefully planted with a poisonous, noxious plant, which is not native to the area, is toxic to cattle and wildlife, and could only have been planted on purpose. I remembered the Falcon Lake tree replanting fiasco and thought, what the F, man? That's pretty weird. Subsequent visits in later years revealed that further work had been done on the Baca Badia site to completely reconfigure the Arios and topography, erasing any sign and making the site virtually unrecognizable. So here are a couple of pictures from the Falcon Lake book. On the left is a picture of the large outcropping of rock where the incident took place. Again, it was not a landing. The object didn't actually ever land. According to Michalak, it hovered above this particular outcropping of rock. What's interesting about this outcropping of rock is that it has a very distinct vein of quartz running through it, and which is visible from the surface. If you look up towards the top of this, you can actually see a little bit of the tree damage that they reported. It's just a little bit of it right here. In the book, there are further descriptions and other photos of the tree damage that they recorded. And on the right are samples of the weird silver alloy that they recovered at the site. There's also, in the chapter where these photos occur, the author produces they had repetitive, numerous analyses done of these samples. And what was strange about these samples is that as the samples were tested over time, the samples themselves seemed to change in a way that was kind of unusual. And you just have to read it. It's very odd. The whole thing about the silver at this site, the silver pieces at this site, is one of the strangest aspects of this particular story. So there it is. I would ask Vallee why he included Maury Island and not Falcon Lake. And also, what might the symbolism of a bracket to a ranching family and a strange silver alloy to an immigrant seeking precious metals might represent. There are so many levels to these stories, it's beyond mind-boggling, which I think is partly what Vallee is really exposing here. Now, some people think Vallee's gone off the wheel with this book. I think he's just finally venturing into the true wild blue where we've been headed all along. When consciousness and matter meet, almost anything might be possible. So one has to look at accounts of both mind and stuff. If it makes me think differently, a book, it's good enough for me to read. Trinity is good enough.